The chill of the pre-dawn air bit through my jacket as I stepped out of the unmarked vehicle, the streetlights casting long, skeletal shadows across the manicured lawns. Julian Vance's smart home loomed, a fortress of obsidian glass and polished chrome, silent and imposing. Every window was a dark, unblinking eye, every corner sharp, precise. The kind of place designed to keep the world out, or, as it turned out, to keep everything in. "Morning, James," the detective grunted, already leaning against a patrol car, a styrofoam cup steaming in his gloved hand. His face was a roadmap of exhaustion, lines etched deep around his eyes. "Glad I could make it, though I doubt I'll find much." I nodded, not bothering to return the pleasantry. My gaze was already sweeping the perimeter. No forced entry, not a scratch on the reinforced front door, no disturbed shrubbery, no broken glass. The entire structure screamed impenetrable. Julian Vance, the tech titan, had built himself a digital sarcophagus. "Still going with suicide, then?" I asked, pulling on my own pair of nitrile gloves, the thin material a second skin. The detective sighed, taking a long sip. Forensic tech ran the initial checks, all systems green. Alarms armed, sensors undisturbed, biometric locks only registered Vance's prints. No external access attempts. No internal anomalies reported by the house AI. The security logs are pristine, a perfect timeline of a man alone in his home. He gestured vaguely towards the house. Found him in his study. Single gunshot wound to the temple. His own custom-built pistol still in his hand, open and shut. "Nothing's ever open and shut when I get called in," I murmured, more to myself than to him. And a man like Julian Vance, meticulously paranoid about his privacy and security, didn't just open and shut himself out of existence without leaving a more complex narrative behind. He was too precise, too controlling. Pristine white walls, gleaming floors, abstract art that seemed to judge my presence. The air was sterile, devoid of any personal scent beyond the faint metallic tang that always lingered at these scenes. Every surface reflected the harsh light of the investigative lamps, showing no dust, no disarray. It felt less like a home and more like a high-tech display case. The study was exactly as described, almost disturbingly neat. His right hand, palm up, still loosely cradled the sleek black pistol. The floor around him was spotless. No shell casing. My eyes narrowed. "Shell casing?" I asked, my voice low, already knowing the answer. The detective stepped closer, keeping a respectful distance from the body. "Retrieved it. It was still in the chamber. Revolver." Vance was a collector, apparently. Likes things. Bespoke. He paused, then added, "Seems he was quite particular about not leaving a mess." A revolver. That explained the lack of a casing on the floor. But it didn't explain the small, almost imperceptible detail I'd already spotted. Vance's fingers, pale and stiff, were wrapped around the pistol grip. But the thumb, usually curled around the backstrap for a firm hold, was extended, almost resting on the cylinder release. It wasn't the natural grip of someone firing a weapon, even one pointed at their own head. It was too delicate, like an afterthought. I moved closer, my gaze sweeping the desk. A half-empty glass of amber liquid, a high-end tablet displaying a complex stock market graph, a leather-bound notebook with a single, elegant pen laid precisely beside it, everything in its place. Too much in its place, perhaps. My eyes drifted to the tablet. The stock graph displayed a significant dip in Vance's company's value, dating back about 3 months, followed by a slow, agonizing crawl downwards. A potential motive for despair, the detective would argue, but Vance wasn't known for despair. He was known for ruthlessness, for turning setbacks into opportunities. I knelt, examining the floor beneath the chair. The pristine carpet showed no signs of struggle, no scuffs, no disturbed fibers. But as I leaned in, my specialized flashlight beam sweeping across the deep pile, I saw it. A single, almost invisible thread, finer than a spider's silk, caught in the weave just inches from Vance's left shoe. It was a synthetic fiber, a vivid electric blue, stark against the muted charcoal of the carpet. It didn't match Vance's clothes, nor the furniture, nor any of the visible textiles in the room. My breath hitched. This was the kind of detail that screamed. A tiny, defiant flag in a sea of manufactured order. Anything. The detective asked, his voice pulling me back. I straightened, keeping my expression neutral, just getting a feel for the place. He certainly liked his security. My eyes found the small, almost flush-mounted camera lens in the corner of the ceiling, barely visible. Any footage from inside the study? The detective shook his head. Vance had a privacy setting. All internal cameras automatically disable when he's in a room unless he manually overrides. No recording of the incident. Convenient or perfectly planned. I walked a slow circle around the room, taking it all in. The air was still, heavy with the weight of the impossible. A man dead in a sealed room, all evidence pointing to self-inflicted demise, yet my gut churned with a familiar unease. The delicate grip on the pistol, the unnatural stillness of the scene, and now that vibrant blue fiber, each a tiny fracture in the narrative presented. This wasn't suicide. This was a meticulously crafted illusion. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to stage this, to make it look like Vance had been utterly alone. But if he was alone, how did that fiber get there? And why the odd, almost hesitant placement of his thumb on the pistol? "I'll need to take the body in," I said, turning to the detective. "Standard procedure, but this one needs a thorough workup. Full toxicology, trace evidence, internal examination. And I want a deep dive on all of Vance's digital footprints, not just the security logs. Every device, every server, every cloud account." The detective just nodded, resigned. He knew me well enough to know that when I started talking about thorough workups, it meant I wasn't buying the easy answer. "We'll arrange for the transport," he said, pulling out his radio. "Where do I want him?" "The usual," I replied, my gaze lingering on the lifeless tech mogul, the architect of his own digital fortress. "Hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested." This wasn't just a dead man in a house. This was a sealed tomb, and I had a feeling the real story was buried deep beneath its polished surfaces, and I was going to dig it out. This felt like a challenge, a complex lock waiting for the right key. And for a moment, a fleeting shadow of a past failure flickered in my mind, a case I hadn't been able to crack. I pushed it down. "Not this time, not again." "The usual," I replied, my gaze lingering on the lifeless tech mogul, the architect of his own digital fortress. "Hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested." That's where the previous chapter ended. I pulled myself from the grim silence of that hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested room, the air thick with the metallic tang of inevitability. My gut, that old, unreliable compass, was already spinning wildly. Suicide. In a house so locked down, so meticulously crafted for an impenetrable digital existence, it felt less like a choice and more like a carefully orchestrated vanishing act. Vance wasn't the type to go quietly, let alone clumsily. I made my way back to my sanctuary, my lab. It wasn't some sterile, white-tiled box, though cleanliness was paramount. This was a fortress of a different kind. Steel benches, banks of flickering monitors, the hum of specialized machinery a constant lullaby. Here, under the unforgiving glare of my microscopes, secrets couldn't hide. The world outside might rush to judgment, but here only the evidence spoke. The collection boxes from Vance's residence sat on a reinforced cart, each sealed, labeled, and logged. The lead investigator, a no-nonsense type with tired eyes, had tried to rush me, muttering about standard procedures and open and shut cases. I'd just given him my usual blank stare. Experience had taught me that the most open and shut cases were often the ones with the deepest, darkest seams. I started with the obvious, then moved to the almost invisible. First, the clothing Vance had been wearing. A silk robe, expensive, impeccably clean, save for the obvious trauma. I laid it flat on the stainless steel examination table, illuminated by an overhead array of UV lights. Everything was high-end, bespoke. No surprises there. My stereo microscope was my first pair of eyes, magnifying every stitch, every fiber. I worked slowly, systematically, a forensic archaeologist sifting through layers of time. I used specialized tweezers, barely thicker than a human hair, to pick off stray fibers, dust motes, anything that didn't belong. Each tiny specimen went into its own labeled microvial. Most of it was environmental household dust, Vance's own skin cells, fibers from his expensive carpets. Predictable, utterly mundane. Then I moved to the skin swabs taken from his hands, his face, his neck, even the soles of his feet. These were the real storytellers, often holding microscopic narratives of the last few hours of a life. The swab from his dominant hand, the one that had supposedly held the weapon, was clean, almost unnervingly so. No powder residue, no trace of combustion byproducts. That was my first wait that doesn't add up moment. If he'd fired a weapon, there should have been something, even a faint trace, on his skin. I made a mental note to check the weapon itself more thoroughly, but the absence here was already a red flag. I fired up the scanning electron microscope, its vacuum pump sighing to life. This was where the real magic happened, where the world shrunk to atomic levels, revealing structures invisible to the naked eye. I loaded a sample from under Vance's fingernails, a standard collection point, often yielding the most unexpected finds. The SEM's electron beam scanned across the surface, painting a grayscale image on the monitor. Fibers, more skin cells, a few dust mites. Then a cluster of what looked like minute, iridescent shards. My brow furrowed. They weren't glass. Too uniform, too crystalline. I zoomed in, manipulating the controls with practiced ease. The shards resolved into distinct, elongated structures, almost like tiny, flattened needles. They glowed faintly under the electron beam, a strange, almost unnatural luminescence. My fingers flew across the keyboard, initiating an energy-dispersive X-ray spectroscopy, EDS analysis. The machine hummed, analyzing the elemental composition of the unknown material. The results flashed on the screen. High concentrations of titanium, aluminum, and an unusual amount of a rare earth element I'd only seen in specialized industrial applications. Not a common household material. Not something I'd pick up walking down the street, and certainly not something I'd expect to find under the fingernails of a tech CEO in his hermetically sealed smart home. This was big. This was a foreign body, introduced from an outside source, and it wasn't just under his fingernails. I re-examined the initial stereo microscope samples. There, caught in the weave of his silk robe, barely visible, were more of the same iridescent shards. A few were even embedded in the skin around the entry wound, almost like microscopic shrapnel. My mind raced. How could Vance, alone in his secure residence, have come into contact with such a material? It didn't fit the suicide narrative. Not one bit. Suicide meant a singular, isolated act. This suggested contact, struggle even with something or someone external. Next, the gas chromatography mass spectrometry, or GCMS. I prepared a sample from a swab taken from Vance's lips and another from a tiny residue found on the inner seam of his robe collar. The GCMS separated the complex mixture into individual chemical components, then identified each one. The machine chugged, the chromatogram tracing peaks and valleys across the screen. The lip swab was fairly unremarkable, consistent with his recent meal and perhaps a beverage, but the residue from the robe collar. A series of small, distinct peaks appeared, identifying a complex organic compound. My database cross-referenced it. It was a synthetic polymer, a highly specialized type of adhesive or sealant, often used in precision manufacturing or for very specific high-strength bonding applications. And critically, it contained a trace of a powerful, fast-acting sedative, on his collar, and those strange industrial particulates under his nails and embedded in his skin. Vance hadn't taken his own life. He hadn't even been fully conscious when he died, not if that sedative was in play. Someone had gotten close enough to administer it, perhaps through a quick, almost imperceptible contact, then handled him, leaving those unique particulates behind. The absence of gunpowder residue on his hand, the strange material, the sedative, it all screamed murder. The official narrative, the one the lead investigator was so keen on, was dead wrong. This wasn't a suicide. This was a meticulously planned, almost surgically executed murder designed to look like a self-inflicted end. The killer had been careful, almost brilliant, but not careful enough to escape the scrutiny of my lab. My past failure, the one that still pricked at the edges of my memory, urged me forward. I wouldn't miss a single detail this time. The tension in the room was palpable, or maybe that was just my own adrenaline. I had the truth, or at least the start of it. Now I just had to convince everyone else. And then I had to find out who. The usual, I'd replied, my gaze lingering on the lifeless tech mogul, the architect of his own digital fortress. I pulled myself from the grim silence of that hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested room, the scent of antiseptic and something far less sterile clinging to my clothes. The initial examination by the medical examiner had been swift, confirming what I already suspected. A single, clean shot to the temple. Too neat, too precise for a man who built an empire on intricate layers of defense. My mind, however, wasn't on the bullet's trajectory. It was on the digital ghosts, the ones humming invisibly within Vance's smart home. I'd seen enough suicides to know the subtle tells, the desperate fumbling, the hesitant marks. This wasn't it. This felt staged. I spent the next morning holed up with the digital forensics specialist, a young woman with a formidable intellect and an even more formidable stack of energy drink cans on her desk. We were in a secure, windowless room at the precinct, surrounded by blinking servers and the low hum of cooling fans. My eyes burned from staring at lines of code and time-stamped logs. "Okay, James," he began, him finger tracing a line on a tablet displaying a schematic of Vance's home network. "We've pulled everything. Router logs, server access, camera feeds, motion sensors, smart lock history, even his toaster's Wi-Fi connection if it had one." She paused, pushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "And here's the kicker, no external breach, zero, nada. It's like the house itself was hermetically sealed from the outside world." That confirmed my gut feeling, but it also tightened the knot in my stomach. If no one got in, how did Vance end up dead? What about internal access? Any unusual logins, devices, or commands from inside? She nodded, her expression grim. "That's where it gets interesting. We found a sequence of commands sent to the main security hub about an hour before the estimated time of death. They disabled the external camera feeds for a 20-minute window, then reactivated them. But the internal cameras, they were never disabled, just overwritten. The footage from that same 20-minute window is gone, replaced with a loop of the empty hallway from an hour prior." My breath hitched. Overwritten, not deleted. That was a critical distinction. Deletion leaves a trace, a gap. Overwriting was a deliberate act to conceal. And the smart locks, all showing internal activation. Every door and window locked from the inside. No forced entry registered by the sensors. No tampering with the biometric readers. It's as if Vance himself walked around, locked everything up tight, and then he died. She looked at me, her eyes wide. But here's what doesn't add up. The commands to disable and then re-enable the external cameras and the overriding of the internal footage, they came from an unregistered device. A ghost in the machine, essentially. It connected to the local network, executed the commands, and then disconnected. No IP, no MAC address, nothing identifiable. It was like a phantom just materialized, did its business, and vanished. A phantom. A digital ghost. This wasn't just a simple break-in. This was intricate, almost elegant in its deception. Someone had not only gained access to Vance's highly secure network, but knew precisely how to manipulate its internal systems to create a perfect illusion of an unbreached fortress. My mind raced, trying to reconcile the physical evidence, the neat bullet, the undisturbed scene with this sophisticated digital subterfuge. It was too clean, too precise for a desperate act, too complex for a casual intruder. Later that day, the detective, a gruff veteran with a tired face, set up initial interviews in a cramped interrogation room. I sat in, observing, my mind still replaying the digital specialist's findings. First up was the estranged business partner, a man named Marcus. He was slick, impeccably dressed, and radiated an air of barely contained ambition. Julian and I had our differences, sure, he admitted, leaning back, a smirk playing on his lips. He was a visionary, but sometimes a difficult one. We split ways a year ago over creative control, but murder, that's absurd. I was at a charity gala across town all evening, plenty of witnesses. He listed a string of prominent names, each alibi sounding watertight on the surface. Yet his casual dismissal of Vance's death, his almost gleeful recounting of their professional divorce, pricked at my instincts. He had motive, perhaps, but did he have the technical prowess for this kind of digital ghost trick? Next, the stepdaughter, a young woman with a sharp gaze and an even sharper tongue. She wore expensive clothes, but her eyes held a weariness that spoke of long-standing resentment. Julian was a control freak, she spat, crossing her arms. He controlled everything, even my inheritance. Thought he could just cut me out after my mother passed. I hated him, yes, but I didn't kill him. I was with friends miles away at a club. We have pictures, videos. Her alibi, like Marcus's, seemed solid, but the anger was raw, palpable, and the talk of inheritance. Another layer to peel back. Finally, the personal assistant, a quiet, unassuming man who had worked for Vance for over a decade. He looked genuinely distraught, his hands trembling as he spoke. Mr. Vance was demanding but fair, mostly. I was home alone that night. My wife was out of town. I was watching a movie. I don't have an alibi, not really, just myself. He seemed too honest, too transparent in his distress, almost too perfect a suspect for his lack of an alibi. But why would he orchestrate such a complex digital ruse? He wasn't known for his technical skills. I leaned back in my chair as the personal assistant was let out, the detective running a hand through his thinning hair. So, everyone's got an alibi, James, except the one guy who looks like he couldn't swat a fly. Alibis that don't account for a ghost device, detective. I countered, my voice low. Alibis that don't explain how someone gained access to Vance's network, disabled specific cameras, and then overwrote internal footage without leaving a trace of entry. These weren't just simple commands. They were highly specific, targeted manipulations. Someone knew Vance's system inside and out, or they had the means to study it. The detective grunted, looking at the stack of interview notes. I rest saying one of them is lying, or they hired someone who did all this tech wizardry. I'm saying the physical scene screams suicide, but the digital evidence screams murder. I explained, the words feeling heavy on my tongue. And the two don't align. Not yet. It makes me wonder if I'm missing something obvious, if I'm overthinking it. But that ghost device, it's a deliberate act of concealment. Suicide doesn't try to hide its own evidence. Someone wanted to make it look like Vance was alone, completely isolated when he wasn't. The tension in the room was thick, a silent acknowledgement of the chasm between what we saw and what we suspected. This wasn't just a physical crime. It was a battle of wits against a perpetrator who understood the very fabric of digital security. And for a moment, just a fleeting, unsettling moment, I questioned my own ability to navigate this digital labyrinth. Had I finally met a killer whose methods were beyond my comprehension? The thought was a bitter pill. But then I remembered Vance's unbreached fortress and the ghost that had danced through its digital halls. My job was to find that ghost and expose its human lies. The fluorescent hum of the hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested, was a dull, persistent drone, a soundtrack to the sterile silence. The air was frigid, smelling faintly of antiseptic and something metallic, a familiar scent that always sharpened my senses. I stood by the stainless steel table, my gaze fixed on Julian Vance. His face, now drained of its earlier rictus, was unsettlingly serene, almost peaceful. Too peaceful for a man who, just hours before, had been caught in what was initially presumed to be a final, desperate act. The pathologist, a meticulous woman with a no-nonsense demeanor and hands that moved with practiced efficiency, narrated him findings. No signs of external trauma, James. No defensive wounds, no ligature marks. The initial assessment holds no struggle. She paused, adjusting a lamp. Internally, organs appear largely unremarkable. Heart, lungs, liver, all within expected parameters for a man of his age and build. Brain tissue shows some minor cellular distress, consistent with a sudden cessation of function but nothing specific pointing to a direct cause. I nodded, my mind racing. What about the trace elements? Anything in the blood, the gastric contents, the tissues? She shook her head. Standard toxicology panel came back clean. Nothing in the way of common poisons, narcotics, or even high levels of prescription medication. It's clean, almost unnervingly so. Unnervingly so. That phrase resonated with me. It was the same feeling I'd gotten back at Vance's pristine, smart home. Everything was too perfect, too undisturbed. Suicide was still the official police theory, quietly gaining traction in the absence of any other explanation. The detective, observing from a respectful distance, seemed to be leaning that way, his posture reflecting a desire for a straightforward resolution. But I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that we were missing something fundamental. My gaze drifted over Vance's body again, searching for an answer where there seemed to be none. No broken bones, no punctures, no burns. The skin was intact, yet the man was dead, and I was convinced he hadn't done it himself. Could you run a more exhaustive panel? I asked the pathologist. Something that looks for rare neurotoxins, highly specialized compounds, something that might degrade quickly or leave minimal trace. He raised an eyebrow, a flicker of professional skepticism in his eyes. James, we're talking about substances that are exceedingly difficult to acquire, let alone administer without leaving a trace. And the cost for such a broad-spectrum, obscure analysis is significant, without more specific indicators. The indicator is the lack of any other indicator, I countered, my voice low but firm. Think about it. A man dies in a fortress, no forced entry, no visible weapon, no struggle, and now no obvious cause of death that fits suicide or conventional murder. What if the weapon wasn't conventional? The pathologist considered this, her lips pursed. What are you suggesting? Something that just stopped his heart without touching him. I leaned closer to the table, my voice dropping to a near whisper. What if it wasn't a physical weapon at all in the way we understand it? What if it was invisible? Something that disrupts the body at a cellular level, or interferes with neural pathways without leaving a visible wound or a common chemical signature. My mind flashed back to the digital anomalies at the house. The brief, almost imperceptible blip in the network log. The way the climate control had spiked for a second, then normalized. Could these be connected? Could a sophisticated perpetrator have used a directed energy pulse? Something that could be aimed through walls, causing a localized physiological shutdown, or a highly refined, airborne neurotoxin that vanished minutes after deployment, designed to mimic a natural cardiac event. The implications were enormous. A directed energy weapon, perhaps. I mused aloud, half to myself. Or an ultrasonic frequency designed to induce cardiac arrest. Or a highly volatile, rapidly dissipating gas that targets the nervous system. The pathologist looked at me, his skepticism giving way to a hint of intrigue. Those are highly speculative, James. We're talking about technologies that are either experimental, highly classified, or bordering on science fiction. But not impossible, I pressed. Not in Vance's world. This man was a titan of tech. He dealt in the bleeding edge of innovation. What if his killer did too? I knew I was pushing the boundaries of conventional forensic thought, perhaps even sounding a little unhinged to someone accustomed to bullet trajectories and toxicology reports. But the pieces, however outlandish, were starting to fit a different puzzle. The lack of any struggle, the pristine scene, the intact security, the clean internal findings, it all pointed to an attack that bypassed physical interaction entirely. This wasn't just a physical crime, nor a simple digital one. It was a fusion, a meticulously planned assassination using a method designed to leave no trace, to be deemed natural or self-inflicted. The detective, who had been listening intently, finally spoke, his voice betraying a hint of his own internal struggle. "So, I rest saying someone could have killed him without even being in the house, without touching him with something we can't see." "Precisely," I confirmed, meeting his gaze. "Which means we're not looking for a bloody knife or a spent casing." This was a whole new level of complexity. It meant admitting to myself and to the team that I was venturing into territory where I wasn't entirely comfortable, risking another professional misstep like the one that still haunted my sleep. But the alternative, letting Julian Vance's killer walk free, confident in their untraceable method, was unacceptable. The tension in the room was palpable, a shared understanding that the comfortable boundaries of their investigation had just dissolved. This wasn't just a murder, it was a challenge, a declaration from a killer who believed they were beyond detection. And I, James, was determined to prove them wrong. The hunt for the invisible weapon had just begun. The cold knot in my stomach only tightened as the hours bled into the next morning. My office, usually a sanctuary of controlled chaos, felt like a pressure cooker. The theoretical applications of highly advanced, potentially dangerous technology. It was a rabbit hole I hadn't anticipated. Julian Vance wasn't just a tech CEO. He was a pioneer, pushing boundaries that most of us hadn't even imagined. And someone had used that against him, right under his own roof. I was sifting through digital schematics of Vance's smart home, trying to visualize a breach that left no trace when my desk phone buzzed. It was the lead investigator. His voice, usually gruff but steady, held an edge of something I couldn't quite place: urgency, maybe a hint of bewilderment. "James," he started without preamble, "we've got another one. He was found in a deserted warehouse district down by the old docks. Looks like a robbery gone bad, or maybe a hit. The local patrol found him half concealed under a tarp." A robbery? That didn't sit right. Vance's case screamed precision, not a messy street crime. "Another one?" I asked, my mind already racing, trying to connect the dots. "Who is it?" "A former employee of Vance's company," the investigator replied. "Name's Mark Jensen. Apparently he was let go a few months back. They're calling it in as an emergency. We need you down at the specialized facility's basement where an emergency autopsy had been requested. See if you can find anything at all that links it to Vance." A former employee, a robbery gone bad. He was found in a warehouse district, an emergency autopsy. My gut clenched. This felt too convenient, too loud. Vance's death had been silent, meticulous. This new incident was a cacophony designed to grab attention, a calculated diversion. I grabbed my kit and headed out, the city lights still muted by the lingering pre-dawn haze. The drive to the specialized facility was a blur of internal debate. Was this a genuine lead, a separate incident, or the killer's way of muddying the waters? My instincts screamed the latter. The killer was too smart, too careful to suddenly resort to such a crude method unless it served a very specific purpose. Arriving at the facility, the air was thick with the sterile scent of disinfectant and something else, a metallic tang I knew too well. The specialized facility's basement was a labyrinth of stark corridors and humming equipment. The forensic pathologist, a stoic woman with tired eyes, was already prepping. The new victim, Mark Jensen, lay on the steel table, stark against the bright lights. "James," the pathologist greeted, a nod acknowledging the unspoken urgency. "He's got a single gunshot wound to the chest. Close range, looks like a large caliber. No signs of struggle, surprisingly." I moved closer, donning gloves. Jensen was a man in his late 30s, average build. His clothes were rumpled, a cheap jacket, jeans, worn sneakers, typical working-class attire. But something snagged my attention immediately. His hands. They were clean, almost pristine, no grime or calluses despite being found in a supposedly deserted warehouse district. And his fingernails were trimmed short, neatly. Not the hands of someone who'd been struggling, even working manual labor. No signs of struggle, you said. I murmured, running a gloved finger along the edge of his jacket. His clothes are creased. There's no tears, no scuff marks on his shoes that would indicate a drag or a fight on a rough warehouse floor. The pathologist peered over her spectacles. Indeed, the scene description mentioned a struggle, broken crates, scattered debris, but his body tells a different story. I leaned in, examining the wound. The entry point was clean, almost surgical in its precision, not the messy blowout I'd expect from a close-range, large-caliber shot in a chaotic struggle. And the weapon, not recovered at the scene, she replied. But based on the wound characteristics, my preliminary assessment suggests a heavy-gauge handgun, possibly a.45 or similar. My eyes scanned Jensen's body again, looking for any other anomalies. His wallet was missing, his pockets turned inside out, classic robbery. But the staging was too neat. Too much effort put into looking like no effort at all. Then I saw it. Tucked just under his left earlobe, almost invisible against his skin, was a faint, perfectly circular indentation. It wasn't a bruise, not a cut. It was a pressure mark. And it reminded me unnervingly of the minute marks I'd found on Vance's temple, the ones that suggested a device had been pressed there. "Hold on a minute," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. I retrieved a small, specialized magnifying glass from my kit. "Can you get me a closer look at this area, just behind the ear?" The pathologist adjusted the light. Under magnification, the tiny, almost imperceptible mark became clearer. A perfect circle about 5 millimeters in diameter. It was too precise to be accidental. "What is that?" the pathologist asked, intrigued. "I'm not sure yet," I admitted, my mind racing. "But it's similar to something I found on Vance. A pressure point. As if a small, circular device was briefly but firmly pressed against the skin. This wasn't a robbery gone bad. This was a message. A very specific, very clever message. The killer wanted us to see a robbery, to see a former disgruntled employee, to see a crude, violent death. They wanted us to think the killer was someone impulsive, someone driven by anger or greed. But they'd left their signature, a subtle nod to their true sophistication. This killer wasn't just good, they were arrogant. They were taunting us, daring us to look past the obvious, to see the puppet strings behind the performance. They knew I'd be on the Vance case. They knew I'd be looking for patterns, and they had provided one. The robbery was too clean, the struggle non-existent. Jensen's death wasn't a random act of violence. It was a meticulously crafted tableau, designed to divert our attention from the digital ghost in Vance's home to a more conventional physical trail. This marked Jensen was a sacrificial lamb. His death meant to point us in the wrong direction, perhaps even to frame someone, or to make us believe Vance's death was connected to corporate espionage or a disgruntled employee rather than something far more insidious and technologically advanced. A cold certainty settled over me. This killer wasn't just covering their tracks, they were actively creating false ones. My initial doubt, the fleeting thought that perhaps I was overthinking Vance's case, evaporated. This was confirmation. This was a challenge. And I had just picked up the gauntlet. The game had just escalated. The image of Vance's secured home, a fortress breached from within, still gnawed at me. A message, I'd thought, not a robbery. But what kind of message and for whom? My mind kept cycling back to the details, the misplaced items, the subtle inconsistencies that screamed orchestrated. The chill of the hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested, did little to settle my unease. It was a sterile, unforgiving space, all stainless steel and harsh fluorescent lights, a stark contrast to the opulent mess of Vance's living room. The air here carried that familiar metallic tang, a scent that always tightened my jaw. I watched the pathologist, a quiet, efficient woman with sharp eyes and even sharper tools, begin her work. She moved with practiced grace, each incision precise, each observation noted in a low murmur to her assistant. Time of death still holding at roughly 2 a.m., James. The pathologist confirmed, his voice flat. Based on lividity and rigor. External examination shows significant blunt force trauma to the head and torso. Looks like a brutal struggle. I nodded, my gaze fixed on Vance's unmoving form. The face was bruised, distorted, but it was the chest that held my attention. Several ribs were fractured, and a deep contusion darkened the skin over his sternum. On the surface, it screamed savagery, but my gut was screaming something else entirely. "Any defensive wounds?" I asked, leaning closer, my eyes tracing the faint lines on the victim's forearms. The pathologist hummed, peering through a magnifying visor. "Minimal. A few scrapes consistent with falling or being knocked against something. Nothing to suggest a prolonged fight for his life against an armed attacker." She paused, her probe gently parting the flesh around a particularly nasty-looking impact point on Vance's left side. "But the force, it's tremendous. Look at this internal bruising, the sheer compression. It's almost too neat for a random beating. Too neat." That phrase echoed in my head. That was it. That was the weight that doesn't add up moment I'd been anticipating. A crude, violent death, yet too neat. I stepped closer, my gloved fingers brushing the edge of the table. The pathologist stepped aside, allowing me a clearer view. The fractured ribs weren't scattered haphazardly. They formed a distinct pattern, almost a localized collapse. It wasn't the widespread damage of a repeated beating with a blunt object, nor the concentrated impact of a single, heavy blow from a baseball bat or crowbar. This was different. This was focused, as if a very specific, high-pressure force had been applied, not broadly but precisely. This wasn't just a killer trying to mislead us. This was a killer employing a method designed to look like one thing while being something far more deliberate. The pattern of internal injury, the way the bone had splintered inward, it felt engineered. My mind, unbidden, flickered back. The stale air of that old processing plant, the smell of ozone and burnt metal. The crumpled body of the foreman, crushed against a malfunctioning press. The initial ruling was an accident, a tragic error. But I'd pushed for more, for a deeper look at the machinery, the specific failure point. I'd found the subtle signs of tampering, the almost invisible alteration that turned a safety mechanism into a death trap. But I hadn't pushed hard enough. The evidence, complex and technical, had been dismissed. A disgruntled colleague, convenient and easy, had been blamed. An innocent person, a man with a family, had gone to trial. He'd been wrongly accused, and I, James, had failed to convince the court of the truth. I had focused too much on the what and not enough on the how. I hadn't looked beyond the obvious. My breath hitched. The memory was a dull ache, a constant reminder of my most profound professional failure. The pressure in this case, the scrutiny I knew was coming from the detective and the higher-ups. It was already mounting, and now this strange, precise violence. They was I seeing patterns that weren't there. They was I overthinking it, driven by the ghosts of past mistakes. The self-doubt was a bitter taste in my mouth, sharp and unwelcome. "James." The pathologist's voice cut through my internal monologue, pulling me back to the present. "I look like I've seen a ghost." I shook my head, clearing the fog. "No, just this injury. Have I seen anything quite like it before?" She frowned, adjusting her visor. "Not exactly. The blunt force trauma is undeniable, but the localized compression, it suggests something highly specific. Not a fist, not a boot. Almost like a pneumatic ram or a very powerful, focused impact tool." She paused, then added, "And yet there are no corresponding external marks from a device, no residue, no specific impression. Just the widespread bruising that makes it look like a struggle." Exactly. That was the trick. The killer had managed to create a brutal internal injury while leaving only generic external signs of violence. It was a masterful deception. "Check for any microfractures, any unusual bone dust," I instructed, my voice regaining its steady resolve despite the tremor in my hands. "And specifically, look at the edges of the sternum fracture. I want to know if there's any evidence of extreme, rapid pressure application, something beyond what a simple impact would create." The pathologist gave me a curious look but complied, turning her attention back to Vance's chest cavity. My eyes scanned the room, the sterile tools, the white tiles. This wasn't just a message, it was a signature. A signature that spoke of advanced knowledge, of a deliberate, almost scientific approach to murder. And it screamed of the tech world Vance inhabited. Julian Vance, the visionary CEO, had built an empire on precision and innovation. They was his killer using that very same ethos against him. I remembered a vague article years ago about Vance's early ventures. Something about high-pressure fluid dynamics or specialized industrial tooling before he pivoted to consumer tech. A fleeting detail barely registered at the time. Could there be a connection? The thought sent a fresh wave of tension through me. If I missed it again, if I failed to connect these dots, another innocent person might pay the price. I couldn't let that happen, not again. A signature that spoke of advanced knowledge, of a deliberate, almost scientific approach. I narrowed my eyes, the cold air of the hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested, doing little to clear the fog of my thoughts. The pathologist, a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes, continued his work with practiced efficiency, humming softly under his breath. "Anything else you need from me, James?" he inquired, not looking up, him instruments making a faint, precise clicking sound against bone. I stepped closer, leaning over the stainless steel table, ignoring the sterile tang that always accompanied these scenes. "Just tell me again about the incision, the edges." He sighed, a puff of white air in the refrigerated space. "Still the same, James, clean, laser-like, no tearing, no jaggedness, perfectly uniform depth. It's surgical if I didn't know better, but with a degree of precision I've rarely seen outside of very specialized fields." She paused, her gloved fingers tracing the faint line on Vance's chest. "Even then, usually it's internal. To achieve this externally without any discernible entry point damage or secondary marks, it's remarkable. Remarkable, that was the word. Not just clean, not just precise. Remarkable. My gaze drifted from the incision itself to the surrounding skin, then to the man's face. Julian Vance, the tech visionary, now just a shell, a puzzle. His security systems had been impenetrable, his home a digital fortress. Yet someone had bypassed it all, not with brute force, but with something akin to art. And no residue, no trace material from the cutting edge. I pressed, my voice low. The pathologist shook her head, her movements economical. "Nothing. We've swabbed, scraped, used microspectroscopy. It's like the blade itself left no impression, no microscopic debris. A clean molecular separation." She looked at me then, her expression a mixture of professional curiosity and mild exasperation. "It's almost as if the material was vaporized or separated at an atomic level, which, frankly, is absurd for a simple cutting tool." "Or not so simple," I murmured, more to myself than to her. The word echoed in my mind. Molecular separation. I thought of the perfect cuts, the lack of surrounding tissue trauma. This wasn't a scalpel, not even a diamond blade. This was something else entirely. Something that required an immense amount of control, power, and incredibly specialized knowledge. A flicker of a memory, an old conference I'd attended years ago, a presentation on emerging manufacturing techniques. It was a fringe field then, almost theoretical. They'd talked about focused energy, about materials being altered or separated without physical contact, using highly concentrated beams. "Did you check for any residual heat signature?" I questioned, a sudden urgency in my tone. "Even a fleeting one, or localized cellular damage consistent with rapid thermal expansion and contraction?" The pathologist frowned. "We did a preliminary thermal scan, yes, but nothing significant. The body temperature was already dropping, I suppose if it was instantaneous. But what are you thinking, James?" "Focused energy," I said, the words tasting strange on my tongue. "Like a femtoscon laser, or even an advanced ultrasonic cutter, but one operating at an incredibly high frequency, precisely tuned for organic tissue." She paused, her gloved hand hovering over Vance's chest. "Femtoscon. James, those are used for micro-machining, for eye surgery, for manipulating individual cells. They require massive power sources, incredibly precise aiming systems, and they leave a signature. A microscopic heat-affected zone, even if minimal. We haven't found anything. But if the energy was so finely tuned, so perfectly calibrated, that the cellular disruption was only along the intended line, I countered, my mind racing. And if the delivery system was equally advanced, perhaps even miniaturized, disguised, a chill snaked up my spine. This wasn't just a murder. This was a demonstration, a showcase of terrifyingly advanced technology and surgical skill. It explained the lack of forced entry, the intact security. The killer hadn't needed to break anything. They had simply opened Vance up precisely, meticulously, and then closed him again, leaving no trace. The precision wasn't just about the wound, it was about the entire operation. I ran a hand over my chin, the stubble rasping. Think about it. The way the security systems were bypassed without a trace, the digital ghost, now this physical ghost, a method of entry and exit, both digital and physical, that leaves no discernible footprint. It's a parallel approach. The pathologist considered this, her brow furrowed. So you're suggesting someone with access to cutting-edge, perhaps even experimental, medical or industrial technology, someone who knows how to apply it with surgical precision. More than that, I answered, the pieces clicking into place with a terrifying clarity. Someone who understands the vulnerabilities of both highly advanced digital systems and the human body at a molecular level. Someone who can operate in both realms with unparalleled mastery. A cold dread settled in my gut. This wasn't a random killer. This was someone operating on a different playing field entirely. They weren't just killing, they were creating a perfect crime, a forensic enigma. It was a signature, all right. The signature of a master craftsman, a ghost in the machine and in the flesh. But then a prickle of doubt. There was eye-reaching. There was the desire to find a complex answer overshadowing a simpler truth. Could it be a simpler, albeit incredibly skilled, assassin using a more conventional, albeit rare, tool? No. The lack of evidence was the evidence. The absence of a conventional trace was the most telling clue of all. This wasn't just about Julian Vance anymore. This was about what kind of individual could wield such power, such precise destruction, and why they would choose to leave such a subtle, almost invisible mark. It wasn't just a message, it was a challenge. A gauntlet thrown down, daring anyone to even see the weapon, let alone trace its wielder. And I had just seen it. Now, the real hunt began. The image of Vance's pristine, smart home, a digital fortress breached without a single digital trace, kept replaying in my mind. No forced entry, no alarms triggered, just a man dead in a perfectly controlled environment. It wasn't just a killing, it was a statement, a meticulously crafted riddle, a signature, all right. The signature of a master craftsman, a ghost in the machine and in the room. My gut told me this wasn't random, wasn't impulsive. This was the work of someone who understood systems, who reveled in control, who saw the world as a series of elegant problems to be solved or, in this case, orchestrated. The way the scene was left, the subtle anomalies, the almost imperceptible shift in the ambient temperature, the precise timing of the security logs being wiped after the event, not before it all pointed to a specific kind of intellect. Someone who didn't just break rules, but bent reality itself to their will. There was only one individual who immediately sprang to mind, an old ghost from my own past, a name whispered in hushed tones in certain circles of the tech world. A figure known for their unparalleled genius in digital architecture, someone who could build an invisible wall or dismantle one with equal frightening ease. Let's just call him the architect. He was the former head of digital infrastructure for Vance's primary competitor, a man whose reputation for intricate, almost impossible digital feats preceded him. He had a history of bitter rivalry with Vance dating back years, a public falling out over intellectual property that had been ugly and very public. The motive was there, the means, certainly the mind. I was sifting through the reports again, a stale coffee cooling beside me, when the detective called. His voice was tight, strained. "James, we've been digging into the background of everyone even remotely connected to Vance. Rival companies, disgruntled employees, you name it. We even looked into the architect you mentioned. My breath hitched. And alibi, he stated, the single word hanging heavy in the air. Ironclad. He was delivering a keynote address at a major tech conference in Tokyo. Live streamed, multiple camera angles, hundreds of witnesses, verifiable timestamps from independent media outlets. He was on stage halfway across the world at the exact time Vance's systems registered his last breath. I felt a cold wave wash over me, a familiar tightening in my chest. No, it couldn't be. The signature, the meticulous detail, the sheer audacity, it screamed the architect. But the alibi, it was perfect, too perfect. My mind reeled. Had I misread the signs? Was I projecting an old nemesis onto a new crime? Doubt, a bitter, unwelcome companion, began to gnaw at me. Then the detective continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. But here's the kicker, James. We just got a preliminary report back from the initial examination of Vance's body. Something subtle, almost missed. They want an emergency autopsy requested. Said they found a microscopic trace of something unusual. Highly specialized. They need you down at the hospital basement. Emergency autopsy requested immediately. The urgency in his tone, the specific request for me, snapped me back to focus. This wasn't about doubting myself. This was about finding the truth, no matter how convoluted. I grabbed my coat, the previous doubt hardening into grim determination. I found the designated examination room, its stainless steel surfaces gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. A colleague, the chief pathologist, was already there, hunched over Vance's body. The sheet was pulled back, revealing the familiar, unsettling tableau. "James, thank God you're here," the pathologist said, straightening up, pushing spectacles higher on his nose. "Look at this." He gestured with a gloved hand towards Vance's left temple, where a tiny, almost invisible mark marred the skin. It was smaller than a pinprick, barely a discoloration. "We almost missed it," she continued, her voice low. "It's not a wound, not exactly, more like a specific kind of burn, a micro-lesion. And when we examined it under an electron microscope, we found this." He pointed to a screen displaying a magnified image, a few scattered, almost crystalline fragments. "It's a rare earth element, James, a highly specialized alloy, used in very specific, cutting-edge micro-robotics and advanced neural interface technology, not something you find just anywhere." My mind raced, connecting the dots. Micro-robotics, neural interface technology. Vance was a tech CEO. The architect was a pioneer in precisely these fields, notorious for his clandestine work on autonomous systems. This trace, this almost imperceptible evidence, was another piece of that impossible signature. It screamed his name, even as his alibi screamed his innocence. I stared at the image on the screen, then back at Vance's lifeless face. The architect, the master craftsman. He was known for his love of complex, multi-layered solutions. He wouldn't just kill someone, he would orchestrate a masterpiece of misdirection. An ironclad alibi across the world. A unique, highly specialized microtrace on the victim's body, pointing to advanced, remote-controlled technology. The perfectly undisturbed crime scene, the ghost in the machine. It wasn't that the architect couldn't have done it. It was that he hadn't needed to be there personally. He had employed an elaborate proxy, a remote method. He had commanded the unseen hand. The implication sent a shiver down my spine. This wasn't just a murder, it was a demonstration. He wasn't just covering his tracks, he was laying down a challenge. And I was the only one who could see it. The game had just become infinitely more complicated and infinitely more dangerous. The hum of the lab's ventilation system usually soothed me, a constant low thrum against the backdrop of meticulous work. Not tonight. Tonight it felt like a drone, an insistent buzz inside my skull, amplifying the thoughts that spun a frantic web. Micro-robotics. Vance's death, the architect, the impossible trace. It all coalesced into a terrifying, elegant design far more sinister than anything I'd encountered. My phone, usually reserved for official channels, vibrated with an unfamiliar urgency. A text, short and blunt, from the lead detective. New development, hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested, now. My stomach tightened. New development rarely meant good news, especially not at this hour. An emergency autopsy implied a sudden, unexpected death or a dramatic shift in an existing case. Was it another victim? A link to Vance I hadn't anticipated. I grabbed my kit, the familiar weight of it a small comfort in the rising tide of unease, and headed out into the biting night air. The drive was a blur of streetlights and silent questions. The city's sprawl seemed to press in on me, the quiet roads amplifying my internal monologue. I kept replaying the faint readings from Vance's smart home, the almost imperceptible energy signatures. Could this new development somehow confirm what my gut was screaming? Could it be another example of this advanced, insidious method? I found the detective waiting for me, his face a mask of grim determination under the stark fluorescent lights of the hospital basement corridor. The air here was heavy, sterile, and cold, carrying a faint metallic tang. He simply nodded, leading me towards a preparation room. "Another one, James," he said, his voice low, flat. "Name's Anya Sharma, one of Vance's lead developers. He was found in her apartment, no forced entry, no obvious cause of death, just stopped breathing." My breath hitched. Sharma. I remembered her name from the preliminary employee roster Vance's company had provided. Young, brilliant, specializing in advanced AI algorithms. This wasn't just a random incident, it was too precise. Inside, the assistant, a quiet, efficient man I'd worked with before, was already prepping the body. Anya Sharma lay still, her features serene, almost peaceful, too peaceful. My eyes immediately went to her hands, her neck, searching for any telltale marks, any sign of struggle or external trauma. Nothing. This killer was clean, meticulous, operating with a chilling level of precision. "Initial assessment points to cardiac arrest," the assistant murmured, not looking up from his work. But the family insisted on a full workup. He was perfectly healthy. I donned my gloves, leaning closer. The skin was smooth, unblemished. I ran my fingers along her hairline, the curve of her ear, then her neck. I pulled out my specialized microscope, a portable unit I always carried, and focused it on the delicate skin around her carotid artery, then behind her earlobe. The magnification showed capillaries, tiny pores, the normal landscape of human skin. Then I saw it. A faint, almost invisible pinprick, slightly discolored, no larger than a grain of sand, just behind her left ear. It was the kind of mark I'd dismiss as a minor blemish, a mosquito bite, or even a tiny mole. "Hold on," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "Can I get me a micro swab from this spot?" The assistant complied, his movements precise. I took the swab, sealing it in a sterile vial. This was it. This was the opening. And inside the nasal cavity, I continued, my gaze fixed on the body, and beneath the eyelids, used the finest tip I have. My mind raced. If my theory about micro-robotics and neural interface was correct, the entry point would be minimal, designed to be overlooked. The delivery system would be equally discreet. The initial autopsy of Vance had been cursory, focused on ruling out obvious foul play. This time, I knew exactly what I was looking for. Hours blurred into a methodical, painstaking examination. We didn't find a bullet or a knife wound or a conventional poison. What we found, deep within the neural pathways surrounding the brainstem, were microscopic lesions, consistent with highly localized, targeted energy bursts. And in the fine tissue of her inner ear, a residue metallic, nearly undetectable without an electron microscope, but present. It was a signature, a calling card. The exact kind of signature I'd been chasing since Vance's death. This wasn't cardiac arrest. This was a silent, invisible execution. The neural interface, the micro-robotics. It wasn't just a theory anymore, it was a horrifying reality. I had the answer, or at least a major piece of it. I had the how, now for the who. As I made my way back to my lab, the lead detective called me again. His tone had shifted from grim to something sharper, laced with barely contained fury. "James, I need to get back here." Now, and bring whatever I found at the hospital." My stomach churned again. The urgency in his voice was different this time, more personal. When I arrived, the atmosphere in my usually quiet lab was thick with tension. A junior colleague, a bright young analyst named Sarah, whom I'd been mentoring for the past year, sat at her desk, her face pale, her hands clasped tightly. The lead detective stood over her, his posture rigid. Another officer was meticulously bagging items from Sarah's personal locker. The detective turned to me, his eyes hard. "We received an anonymous tip, James, said to check Sarah's locker, said he had something interesting." He gestured to a clear evidence bag held by the officer. Inside, glinting dully under the lab lights, was a small, intricately designed data chip. It was the same unique storage device I'd carefully extracted from Vance's home computer, a device I had personally secured in my own locked cabinet, awaiting further specialized analysis. "That's impossible," I stated, my voice flat, betraying the sudden, violent surge of disbelief and anger. "That chip was in my secure storage. No one had access." "Except someone did, James," the detective countered, his gaze unwavering. "And it was found in my analyst's locker, along with a printout of some encrypted files from Vance's personal network, files that haven't been officially accessed by our team." He paused, letting the implications hang in the air. "This looks bad, James, really bad, especially for Sarah." I stared at Sarah, her eyes wide with fear and confusion, then back at the chip. It was a setup, a blatant, vicious frame. The killer wasn't just escalating their methods. They were coming for me, trying to dismantle my investigation, discredit my team, perhaps even use my past professional failure against me, to suggest I was sloppy, that I couldn't control my own evidence, my own people. My past mistake, the one that haunted my quiet moments, had been a lapse in judgment, a trust misplaced that cost me dearly. I wouldn't let it happen again. Not now. Not when a killer was out there, striking with impunity and now threatening those I cared about. The stakes had just become intensely personal. This wasn't just about Julian Vance or Anya Sharma anymore. This was about protecting Sarah, about proving her innocence, and about stopping this architect of death before he destroyed everything I had left. The stale, metallic tang of the hospital basement clung to the air, a scent I'd grown all too familiar with over the years. This wasn't the usual sterile environment of a forensic lab. It was raw, functional, designed for necessity over comfort. The emergency autopsy request had raised more than a few eyebrows, but I'd pulled every string, leveraged every ounce of my professional capital to get it. The clock was ticking, not just on the evidence, but on my own credibility. The killer's frame was a fresh wound, festering in the background, making every step I took feel like I was walking on glass. The medical examiner, a no-nonsense individual with perpetually tired eyes, stood over the gurney, arms crossed. "James, you're asking for something highly unusual here. Another look at Vance. The cause of death was clear. Suicide. And frankly, the chief isn't thrilled about the resources being tied up again, especially after. Well, you know." I know, I cut in, my voice tight. "And I know what I saw, or rather, what I didn't see that doesn't add up. Julian Vance was meticulous. His home was a fortress, yet someone got in, or rather, something did. And it wasn't him pulling the trigger, not really." My gaze swept over Vance's still form, uncovered on the steel table. The details were seared into my memory, the specific angle, the trajectory, the way everything screamed textbook suicide. But the textbook part was precisely what gnawed at me. Too perfect, too clean, too convenient, and the chip, the one planted in Sarah's lab, screamed a message. "I know you're close and I'm coming for you." "What exactly are you looking for?" the medical examiner asked, a hint of exasperation in their tone. "We've done a full scan, toxicology, external and internal examination. There's nothing." "Not nothing," I corrected, stepping closer. "Just nothing obvious. I need a scan for something incredibly subtle, something that would only be present for a very short window after death, something that a standard autopsy wouldn't even register as significant. I'm talking about a specific electromagnetic signature, a residual imprint." The medical examiner raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. An electromagnetic signature. James, are you suggesting he was struck by lightning? No, I responded, my voice dropping, imbued with a conviction that I hoped would override their skepticism. I'm suggesting he was subjected to a very specific, highly targeted frequency. Something that could incapacitate, disorient, or even induce a fatal cardiac event, remotely, without leaving a visible mark. Something that could force a man to appear to take his own life, or at least be unable to prevent it. I leaned in, pointing to a specific area on Vance's temple. The smart home system, the security, the whole digital fortress. It was all designed to keep physical intruders out. But what if the intrusion wasn't physical? What if it was a remote manipulation, a focused energy burst that caused his system to fail? His will to crumble, just long enough to orchestrate the scene. My theory felt like a shot in the dark. It was the only explanation that reconciled the intact security with the irrefutable fact of murder. The killer was too smart to leave a conventional trail. They had to have used something unconventional. And how exactly do you propose we detect this energy burst? The medical examiner asked, sarcasm lacing their voice. We don't have a ghost detector in the basement. Not a ghost detector, I replied, pulling a small, custom-built device from my bag. It was a prototype, jury-rigged from components Sarah and I had scrounged together, designed to detect incredibly faint, transient electromagnetic fields. It's a hypersensitive E-field scanner. If there was a focused energy transfer, even one that dissipates quickly, there might be a residual magnetic imprint on the surface of his skin or even his hair follicles. It wouldn't last long, which is why this emergency autopsy is critical. The medical examiner sighed, running a hand over their face. This is highly unorthodox, James. If this doesn't yield anything, you're going to have some explaining to do. I understand the risk, I added, looking them straight in the eye. But if I'm right, this isn't just about Julian Vance. This killer is escalating. They framed my team. They're trying to discredit me. They will strike again if we don't understand their method. My mention of the framing seemed to finally cut through their professional detachment. The medical examiner nodded slowly. All right, but you operate that thing. I'm just here to observe. I felt a surge of adrenaline mixed with a cold dread. This was it. The last throw of the dice. If this failed, if I found nothing, the official narrative of suicide would stick and the killer would walk free, having successfully derailed my investigation. And my past failure, the one that still haunted my sleep, would be invoked, sealing my fate. I carefully positioned the scanner over Vance's head, starting from the crown and slowly moving it down, centimeter by agonizing centimeter. The device was silent, its small digital display showing only background noise, a chaotic dance of zeros and ones. The air in the basement felt heavy, thick with anticipation and the scent of disinfectants. Every subtle hum from the ventilation system, every distant clang seemed amplified. My hand trembled slightly, a testament to the immense pressure. I focused, breathing shallowly, my eyes glued to the screen. Nothing, still nothing. The medical examiner shifted their weight, a subtle gesture of impatience. Had I been wrong? Was I chasing ghosts, projecting my own fears onto a clean case? Was the killer truly that flawless? Then, as the scanner passed over Vance's left temporal lobe, the display flickered. A sudden, sharp spike. A distinct, repeating pattern emerged, a waveform that was clearly anomalous against the baseline noise. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A specific, resonant frequency. It wasn't random static, it was a signature, a transient magnetic imprint exactly where I had suspected. My mind raced, connecting the dots. This wasn't just a frequency, it was the frequency. I recognized the pattern, a specific harmonic resonance associated with a highly experimental, covert energy weapon that had been developed for non-lethal crowd control, but which, at higher power, could indeed disrupt neurological functions and cardiac rhythms without leaving a physical mark. It was incredibly rare, highly classified, and almost impossible to trace. But I had seen the schematics years ago, during a fleeting consultation for a government project that had been shelved. This signature confirmed it. Julian Vance hadn't taken his own life. He had been targeted. He had been subjected to a remote, silent assault that mimicked suicide. And the killer hadn't just gotten away with murder. They had used a method so advanced, so covert, that it was designed to be untraceable. The medical examiner looked at me, a new, grim understanding dawning in their eyes. What? That's how they did it, and that's how we're going to catch them. The killer's alibi, whatever intricate web they had woven, was about to shatter. They hadn't needed to be in the room. They hadn't needed to leave a single fingerprint. They had only needed to be within range with the right equipment at the right time. The game had just changed, and I was finally ready to play. The faint hum of the server rack was the only sound breaking the silence in my workspace, a steady, rhythmic pulse that mirrored the one thrumming in my temples. Hours had blurred into an indistinguishable stretch of focused intensity, my gaze locked on the oscillating waveform scrolling across the monitor. The magnetic whisper I'd picked up, initially a ghost in the machine, had solidified into a distinct signature. It wasn't just a stray electromagnetic field. It was a deliberate, precise frequency burst. I leaned back, scrubbing a hand over my stubbled chin. My initial theory that Julian Vance had been remotely murdered now had teeth, sharp and undeniable. The killer hadn't needed to bypass the security system. They'd simply used it against him. The smart home, Vance's fortress, had become his tomb. The waveform I was tracing, a series of precisely timed spikes, matched the operational frequency of the house's integrated climate control system, specifically the high-capacity air exchange units in Vance's bedroom. But it wasn't just activating them, it was overriding their safety protocols. This particular frequency, when layered with a secondary, subtler pulse, mimicked an internal system command, a master key for the house's environmental controls. It was a digital ghost, granting access without leaving a physical trace. My fingers flew across the keyboard, cross-referencing schematics of Vance's home automation system. There it was. An industrial-grade inert gas fire suppression system, designed for the server room, but with auxiliary lines running to the main living areas, a contingency for catastrophic electrical fires. The system used a blend of nitrogen and argon, perfectly harmless in small doses, but deadly if it displaced enough oxygen in an enclosed space. Vance's bedroom, sealed by its own smart locks, became a gas chamber. The killer had simply, remotely, triggered the inert gas release, bypassing the smoke detectors and manual overrides. No forced entry, no struggle, no poison, just a slow, silent suffocation engineered by a phantom hand. It was brilliant, terrifyingly so. For a moment, a sliver of doubt, sharp and unwelcome, pricked at me. Had I truly seen everything? Could I have missed something simpler, something more human in its messiness? No, the evidence was too clean, too precise for anything but deliberate remote action. I took a deep breath, the metallic taste of stale coffee on my tongue. The killer's alibi, whatever intricate web they had woven, was about to shatter. My phone buzzed, startling me. It was the detective. "James, you got something." "I've got the how, detective," I replied, my voice hoarse from disuse. "And it's not pretty, meet me. Bring a whiteboard." Half an hour later, the detective stood in my workspace, his arms crossed, a furrow etched between his brows as I laid out the intricate web of digital murder. I showed him the waveforms, the system schematics, the repurposed gas lines. His initial skepticism, a default setting for most law enforcement when faced with such an elaborate theory, slowly melted into grim acceptance. "So they used his own house to kill him," the detective mused, tapping a finger on the monitor screen displaying the gas line diagram. "No physical presence needed. How do we prove that in court, James? A magnetic pulse. Sounds like something out of a pulp novel." "It's real," I insisted, my determination hardening. "And we can prove it. The killer is too smart, too careful. They'll have covered their tracks on the hardware that sent the signal. We need to make them trip." "A trap," the detective stated, his gaze sharpening. What kind of bait? Misdirection, I explained, walking over to a small, cluttered table and picking up a salvaged circuit board from Vance's smart home system. They're watching us. Every official statement, every leaked detail. They'll be looking for us to find them, or their device. We tell them we found something else entirely. Something physical, something they might have overlooked, something that could implicate them directly. The detective leaned against the workbench, a thoughtful expression on his face. Something that would make them nervous enough to move, to expose themselves. Exactly, I affirmed. We leak that a new, critical piece of evidence has been discovered, something that requires an immediate, in-depth examination away from the usual channels, something that implies we're closing in on a physical link, not a digital one. And where would this critical examination take place? The detective asked, already anticipating my next move. We make it public enough, through an unnamed source to a specific news outlet, that a request has gone out. I clarified. A request for a highly sensitive, emergency examination of new findings related to the Vance case. We give them a location that sounds official, discreet, but also a bit unexpected for a tech murder, something to throw them off balance. I paused, letting the idea hang in the air, the tension in the room thickening. We leak that a hospital basement emergency autopsy requested has been scheduled for tomorrow afternoon. Not for Vance's body, not directly, but for a piece of evidence, a microscopic trace, a biological anomaly, something that could only be detected under the most urgent and specialized conditions. The killer won't know what we're supposedly looking at, only that we're looking at something new, something physical, something urgent. The detective nodded slowly, a glint in his eye. A staged event. We announce this emergency autopsy to the world, and then we watch who twitches, who tries to get close, who tries to interfere, who asks too many questions. Precisely, I confirmed, a knot of anticipation tightening in my stomach. We make them think we're closing in on a traditional, tangible clue. While they're distracted by the ghost in the hospital basement, we'll be watching for the real killer to make a move. The trap is set, detective. Now we just wait for the prey to walk into it. The air in the hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested, was cold, sterile, and thick with a tension that hummed beneath the fluorescent lights. I stood beside the detective, hands clasped behind my back, my gaze fixed on the reinforced door at the end of the narrow corridor. We hadn't been waiting long, but every second felt like a drumbeat echoing the last 2 weeks of relentless pursuit. My stomach churned with a familiar mix of anticipation and dread, a feeling I knew all too well from past investigations, one that always preceded the final, irreversible reveal. "You're sure about this, James?" the detective asked, his voice a low rumble. He didn't sound doubtful, just cautious. It was his career on the line, too, if I was wrong. A misstep now, after all this, would be catastrophic for both of us. The memory of that other case, the one that had slipped through my fingers, flickered at the edge of my consciousness. I replied, my own voice steady despite the tremor of anticipation in my chest. "The pieces fit, all of them." I pushed the doubt back, focusing on the meticulously built edifice of evidence. A moment later, the door hissed open, and a junior officer ushered in the venture capitalist. He looked impeccably dressed, as always, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the utilitarian surroundings. He carried himself with an air of practiced composure, but I saw the flicker in his eyes, the almost imperceptible tightening around his mouth. He scanned the room, his gaze briefly snagging on the stainless steel tables beyond a glass partition, then settling on us. "Detective," the venture capitalist began, a smooth, practiced tone. "And James, isn't it? I was told there was a development, another body, a witness perhaps." He tried for casual curiosity, but it landed flat. He knew why he was here. The pretense was a thin veil, easily seen through. "No more bodies, I assure I answered, stepping forward. Just the truth, finally laid bare. And I believe, are uniquely positioned to appreciate its intricacies." The detective moved, subtly blocking the venture capitalist's easiest exit. The junior officer remained by the door, a silent sentinel. The trap was sprung. "I don't understand," the venture capitalist said, a slight frown marring his brow. "I've cooperated fully. My alibi for the night Julian Vance died is ironclad. I was at a charity gala with dozens of witnesses." "Oh, we know where I was precisely," I conceded with a small nod. "That's part of the beauty of my plan. I created a perfect physical alibi. But murder, especially one as intricate as this, always leaves a trail. Sometimes that trail isn't made of footprints or fingerprints, but of data, of invisible whispers in the air." I paused, letting my words hang in the cold air. The venture capitalist's eyes narrowed, a subtle shift from feigned confusion to guarded suspicion. The mask was cracking. When we first examined Vance's smart home, everything screamed suicide. No forced entry systems intact. But then I found the anomalies. Tiny, almost imperceptible deviations from the norm. The first was the air filtration system, a specific volatile organic compound, a VOC, present in trace amounts in the filter from Vance's bedroom, but nowhere else in the house. A compound that dissipates quickly, designed to be untraceable after a few hours. I watched his face. A muscle twitched in his jaw. It had a minor scorch mark, almost invisible without magnification, on one of its internal components. A tiny burn, consistent with a sudden, intense electrical surge, far beyond its operating parameters. We initially dismissed it as a manufacturing defect, but then we cross-referenced it with the smart home's energy logs. I took a breath, letting the details sink in. At 2:17 a.m. on the night Vance died, there was a micro spike in power consumption, isolated to that specific humidifier. Lasted less than a second. Not enough to trip a breaker, not enough to register as a system fault, but enough to register in the deep analytics of the power grid, which we obtained through a warrant. Your alibi places you at the gala, correct? But your smart home system, the one you developed and sold to Vance years ago, the one that ran his entire life, was not at the gala. The venture capitalist's composure was beginning to fray. His eyes darted to the detective, then back to me. "I don't follow. I sold that system years ago. I have no access." His voice had lost some of its practiced smoothness, a slight tremor now audible. "Ah, but you do," I countered, a flicker of triumph igniting within me. "Not direct access, no, but a backdoor. A legacy code string embedded deep within the system's core, designed to allow for remote diagnostics in the event of a catastrophic failure. A backdoor only you, as the original architect, would know how to exploit. We found the digital signature, a unique pattern of data packets originating from a specific, anonymized server farm in a neutral territory that interacted with Vance's network at precisely 2:16 a.m., 1 minute before the power spike. You logged into Vance's system remotely. The detective interjected, his voice low and menacing. And you sent a command that overloaded that humidifier, causing it to aerosolize a specific fast-acting neurotoxin. A vapor designed to be inhaled, leaving almost no trace in the body, mimicking a cardiac arrest or stroke. Julian Vance died not by his own hand, but by a meticulously planned, digitally executed assassination. The venture capitalist let out a short, sharp laugh devoid of humor. "Preposterous. You have no proof of a neurotoxin. You have no proof I accessed anything." He was trying to bluff to regain control, but it was too late. The threads of his carefully woven deception were unraveling before his eyes. "The VOC we found in the air filter," I continued, unwavering. "It was a breakdown product, a unique signature of that specific neurotoxin. We ran it through every database imaginable. It was a custom synthesis designed to degrade rapidly. You thought it would vanish entirely, but a molecule, even a dead one, leaves ghosts. The server farm in the neutral territory, it's registered to a shell company. A shell company whose initial capital funding came from an offshore account that, through a series of complex transactions, eventually traces back to a trust fund set up for your daughter." The color drained from his face. His carefully constructed mask shattered, revealing a raw, desperate anger beneath. The one that bought out my rival, crippling my market share, making my own flagship product obsolete overnight. I lost everything. My company, my reputation, my future. He didn't just win, he annihilated I. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming what I felt he stole. The venture capitalist stumbled back a step, colliding with the detective who stood firm. His eyes, wide and wild, flickered between us, the sterile walls and the inescapable truth. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The silence stretched, heavy and complete, save for his ragged breathing. "Book him, detective," I responded, a profound weariness settling over me, mixed with a grim satisfaction. The ghost in the machine had been unmasked. The weight of the past, of that one failure that had haunted me, finally lifted, replaced by the somber reality of a life taken and a killer brought to justice. It was over, almost. The venture capitalist's eyes, fixed and vacant, followed the detective's hand as it clamped down on his arm. No struggle, no denial, just a profound, unsettling stillness. He was led away, a ghost of the man who had orchestrated such a complex, cold-blooded act. I watched him go, a strange mix of exhaustion and quiet satisfaction settling over me. The air in the observation room, thick with the scent of old coffee and stale adrenaline, seemed to thin, making it easier to breathe. "That's it then," the detective said, running a hand over his tired face. He leaned against the door frame, his gaze meeting mine. "Case closed. Thanks to you, James." I nodded, the words feeling heavy on my tongue. "It always comes down to the details, doesn't it?" He grunted in agreement. "Smallest slivers, the ones everyone else misses." The relief was a slow-acting bomb seeping into my bones, but it wasn't complete. A final, macabre confirmation awaited. I had one more stop to make, a necessary formality to truly put this particular demon to rest. An hour later, I found myself in the sterile, hushed confines of the hospital basement. Emergency autopsy requested. The fluorescent lights hummed with a low, constant drone, reflecting off the gleaming stainless steel and white-tiled walls. The air here was different, too sharper, cleaner, infused with the faint metallic tang that always clung to such places. It was a place of final answers, where the body in its silence spoke volumes. The pathologist, a quiet man with spectacles perched on his nose, was already at work. He looked up as I entered, a nod of recognition passing between us. "James, just finishing up the final report on Vance." I approached the examination table, my gaze falling upon the sheet-draped form. Julian Vance, the tech titan whose empire had crumbled in a single fatal night. His death, once a riddle wrapped in an enigma of smart home tech, was now a solved equation. "Anything new?" I asked, though I knew the answer. My findings had been conclusive. The digital footprint, the precise timing of the environmental controls, the subtle manipulation of the home systems to create a deadly, undetectable trap, it all pointed to one thing. Confirmation of anoxic brain injury, consistent with prolonged oxygen deprivation. The pathologist recited, his voice calm and professional. He gestured to a monitor displaying intricate cross-sections. "The internal markers match your theory perfectly. No struggle, no external trauma. Just a slow, insidious depletion of breathable air, orchestrated remotely. A perfect murder if not for your particular brand of stubbornness." He allowed himself a faint, dry smile. I looked at the monitor, at the stark, undeniable evidence. The venture capitalist had used Vance's own cutting-edge smart home against him. He'd created a sealed chamber, slowly siphoning off oxygen, then vented it just as slowly, leaving no trace of the alteration by the time the security systems triggered a silent alert. Almost. But I'd noticed the fractional, almost imperceptible dips in air pressure, the phantom fluctuations in the HVAC system's power draw, the way certain sensor readings had flatlined for just a hair too long. Tiny anomalies, like grains of sand in a meticulously crafted clockwork. The familiar prickle of unease that had told me to dig deeper, to look beyond the obvious. It was the same feeling that had haunted me after that other case, years ago, the one where I'd missed something crucial, a tiny detail that had allowed a killer to walk away. This case had been a crucible. It had demanded everything: sleepless nights poring over data logs, days spent dismantling security protocols, the relentless pursuit of an invisible enemy. The personal cost had been high. My apartment felt like a forgotten space. My meals were an afterthought, and the lines of fatigue were etched deeper around my eyes. But standing here, amidst the quiet hum of the autopsy suite, looking at the irrefutable evidence, a different feeling surfaced. Redemption. It wasn't a triumphant roar, but a quiet, profound sense of having navigated the treacherous waters, of having pulled a truth from the murky depths of deception. The venture capitalist's motive, laid bare, was as old as time: power, control, the ruthless ambition to acquire Vance's groundbreaking AI tech without paying a dime. He'd seen a way to eliminate a competitor and claim the spoils, all while creating a narrative of self-destruction. The pathologist closed his report, signing off with a flourish. "Well, James, another one for the books. Another life accounted for," I corrected softly, my gaze still on the shrouded form. It wasn't about the books, not really. Walking out of the hospital basement, the cool night air was a welcome shock. This case, Julian Vance's murder, had been a masterclass in calculated malice. It had tested every fiber of my forensic intuition, every ounce of my experience, and I had prevailed. The shadow of that past failure, the one that had weighed so heavily, felt lighter now. It hadn't vanished entirely, but it no longer consumed me. This success didn't erase the past, but it provided a counterweight, a testament to growth, to perseverance. I pulled out my phone, a brief text from the detective confirming the charges were formally laid. Justice, in its slow, methodical way, was being served. Looking up at the stars, a profound sense of purpose settled over me. But there were also those who sought to illuminate them, to bring clarity to chaos. And I, James, was one of them. The work was never truly done, and I would be ready.